Welcome to the next lesson in this chapter about architecture enforcement, where I'm going to show you how to write architecture tests to enforce your software architecture and design rules. Let's start with a brief introduction to architecture testing. These are automated tests that verify the structure and design of your code. There are two popular libraries that you can use to write architecture tests. They are netarchtest and archunit.net. I'm going to be using the first one, which is called netarchtest, because I find the API of this library simpler to work with. And here's an example architecture test written using netarchtest. Architecture testing is also based on enforcing namespace dependencies between your modules, and in this example, I'm defining an array of modules that we should not have a reference to, and I'm also defining an array of namespaces that you may be allowed to access. The next part is defining the assemblies that we want to test. In this case, these will be the user's module assemblies, and then we can write our architecture test using a set of fluent rules. So in this example, we are checking that any types in the user's module assemblies that do not implement an interface of IIntegrationEventHandler and that do not have a dependency on the integration event modules should not have a dependency on the other modules in our system represented by their respective namespaces. And then we can just verify that the result of this architecture test should be successful. And now I'm going to show you how to write an architecture test like this one, and also some other architecture tests that we can introduce for the individual modules. Let's start our implementation by introducing a respective folder that's going to contain our tests. I'm going to call this the test folder, and inside of it I'm going to introduce a new test project. So let's add an XUnit test project. This is the testing library that I prefer to use, although you can write architecture tests in any of the other testing libraries. So let's choose an XUnit test project, and I'm going to call this Evently Architecture Tests. Let's go ahead and create our XUnit test project, and is going to target .NET 8. The next thing I want to do is to introduce a few NuGet packages. I'm also going to update all of the scaffolded packages to the latest version, and then I'm going to install Fluent Assertions, which are going to allow me to write Fluent Assertions as you might expect. You will see what this looks like when we write our first test. Then I'm going to install netarchtest, and we actually want to install the netarchtest.rules NuGet package. So let's go ahead and add this to our test project. You can also see the other library that I mentioned in the introduction of this lesson called archunit.net. So let's close this down, and then I'm going to add a project reference from my architecture test project to the Evently API project so that we can easily see all of our modules. And then let's add some base building blocks for writing our architecture tests. I'm going to define this in the abstractions folder, and let's move the existing unit test file inside, which I'm going to repurpose into something else. Let's make this an internal and static class, which I will call test result extensions. And it's going to have one method instead of a test. There's going to be internal, static, and void, and I'm going to call it should be successful. And this will be an extension method on the test result type coming from netarchtest.rules. Let's give this a name of test result. And what I'm going to say here is that test result failing types, which could be null, should be empty. And this part here is actually Fluent Assertions, which allow me to write assertions for my tests using a Fluent syntax. And the entry point is the should method, and then I can define the assertions that I want to implement. In this case, I want to verify that the netarchtest test result, which contains a collection of failing types, and it should be empty if this is a successful result. And the reason I'm doing this is so that I can get a report of what are the failing types in case this assertion fails. So this is a bit of a clever use of Fluent Assertions and the fact that this is going to contain a collection of types. Let's also rename this file to be test result extensions, and then let's create another class inside that's going to help us write our architecture tests, and I will call it the base test. This is going to be a public abstract class that all of our tests are going to implement, and I just want to define a protected constant inside called the user's namespace. And this will actually point to my user's module, and if you recall, by convention, this is going to be Evently, modules, and then users. I'm also going to define a respective namespace for my users integration events, and the full namespace is Evently, modules, users, integration events. And then let's copy this 3 times and adjust it for the other modules that we have. So let's say that the next one is the events module. I'm going to update the constant names and the namespaces to be events namespace and the respective namespace value. Let's add the ticketing namespace. So I'm going to update this value here, and then the namespace is assigned to these constants. And lastly, let's define the attendance namespace and the attendance integration events namespace. Even if we make a mistake during the setup, we're going to catch this when we write our architecture tests, so there's not much to worry about. And then I'm going to define a folder to represent the type of test that I'm going to write, and these are going to be the test of my layers. And let's add a class inside that I will call the module tests, because it's going to verify the dependencies between my modules. So let's write our first test. I'm going to say that the users module should not have a dependency on any other module in our system. And now we can start writing our test case. So I'm going to make this implement the base test class. And the first thing I want to do is define an array of the other modules that the user module should not be allowed to reference. And these are the events namespace, the ticketing namespace, and the attendance namespace. And then let's define an array of assemblies for the integration events modules. This is going to be another array, and the values will be the events integration events namespace, the ticketing integration events namespace, and the attendance integration events namespace. The next thing I need is a list of assemblies for my users module. So let's call this the users assemblies, and let's define the values for this list. So for the domain layer, I can say type of user, which is available in my domain layer of the users module, and then I can say assembly. For the application layer, I can reference modules, users, application, assembly reference, and assembly. We can do the same for the presentation layer and just replace the namespace with presentation. And then for the infrastructure layer, we can reference our module. So type of users module and then assembly. And now we can write our actual architecture test. So I'm going to say types, and this is the entry point into our netarch test architecture test. And then I'm going to say in assemblies, and let's pass in the users assemblies as the types that we want to verify. And then let's just write the test by referencing all of the other modules and leave out the integration events for the time being. So I'm going to say should not have a dependency on any, and we can pass in the other modules. Then I can say get result to get the test result back, and we have an extension method called should be successful. And this is enough to define our architecture test. I'm going to omit this for a moment so that our test can pass the static code analysis rules, and let's go ahead and execute our architecture test for the users module. And you can see that our test is successfully passing even with the condition for integration events omitted. This is because we aren't consuming any integration events from outside modules. I'm going to add the integration events modules back for just a moment, and let's write another architecture test using the users module test as the baseline. So I'm going to update this to be the ticketing module, and we can say that the ticketing module should not have a dependency on any other module. And then I'm going to replace the ticketing namespace with users namespace, as well as the ticketing integration events namespace with users integration events namespace. Next, we need to update the assemblies. So this will be the ticketing assemblies, and let's reference the types from the ticketing domain. So this will be an order, for example, for the domain layer. Then we can just update the namespace for the application and presentation assemblies, and we can reference the ticketing module for the infrastructure assembly. And now I'm going to omit this collection again for a brief moment, and I will remove it here so that my tests can compile. And let's run the two architecture tests that we have in place, and you will see that the ticketing architecture test is going to fail. And in this case, it's going to tell us that the failing types should be empty, but we actually found that it contains a value of the user registered integration event consumer. And if we head over to this type, you can see that this is indeed defined in the ticketing module, but the problem is that this is a consumer for the integration event coming from a users module. And you can see that this is the case based on the namespace here, which is referencing Evently modules and users. So here's how we are going to fix this. Let me add the integration events modules back, and let's add a filter before we actually check our architecture rules by saying types in assemblies of ticketing assemblies, that, and then we can define our filter, and we can say that we are looking for types that do not have a dependency on any, and let's pass in the integration events modules. Let's do the same for the users tests. So I'm going to paste this code here, and then let's try running our 2 test cases again. And this time you can see that our integration tests are passing. So this is good enough for us to verify that a given module doesn't have a dependency on any of the other modules in the system except the integration events project. So let's add the same test for the events module in this test. I will update the events namespace with users namespace and the event integration events namespace with users integration events namespace. Here I will say type of event, but we have to be careful which type we are using because we have an event type in 3 different namespaces, and the one that we want is in the events module. So I'm going to reference that. Let's update this to events application and events presentation, and here I'm going to say events module. And finally, let's say events assemblies. Let's also add a test for the attendance assembly, so I'm going to add it below. Let's start by updating the test name, and I'm going to say that the attendance module should not have a dependency on any other module. Then I'm going to update the namespaces, and I just need to include the events namespace and the events integration events namespace. Here I'm going to reference the attendee for the domain layer. Then I'm going to update the namespaces for the application and presentation assemblies, and we can reference the attendance module for the infrastructure assembly. I will update this to say attendance assemblies, or actually this should be lowercase. And now I can execute the 4 test cases I have in place, and you can see that all of them are passing, and we have a set of 4 simple architecture tests that are enforcing that the modules that we have in the system do not have a direct reference to each other except the public API of each respective module. We can also write architecture tests for the individual modules that we have in our system. For example, we can enforce the direction of dependencies between the projects in a given module, and we can even enforce some design rules and naming conventions using architecture tests. So let me show you how we're going to implement this. I'm going to add a test folder nested under the users folder because I want my tests for a given module to be close to the definition of that module. So let's add a new test project inside.